So Dave, we're here in the Lake District in this fantastic rustic cabin, and we rode here yesterday, and we were loosely following the route of the Trans-Euro Trail, which starts in Newcastle, goes all the way across the lakes and then all the way south. And we did some trails, we threw in a few trickier trails that aren't on the TET, and we did a bit of road work. And the reason for doing all that was really to take some of the conversations around the Honda CRF450L and start seeing how that bike might compare to an EXC. And fortunately I have a KTM 450 EXC, so it was a great opportunity to compare those two bikes. Okay Dave, we are in Weirdale. We had a comment come through on Facebook. Someone wanted to know about comparing the KTM 450 to the Honda 450 on technical stuff. And in all my films, this is where I come basically. It's called the H, and it's the most kind of technical lane that we've got. It's turned into a bit of a gully. It's quite a steep lane up through one side of a valley, and there's very poor drainage. It's just carved out this gully, and yeah, it's nice and technical, so it should be a good kind of test. I think we'll do it a couple of times, swap bikes and see how we get on with it. I mean, I know how it's going to be on the 450. It's a bit of a trial section. It's like a bit of kudos if you can do it without dabbing, but it's not always possible. So Dave is on my KTM 450 EXC. So that bike has been up this lane lots. Can't say I've always done it cleanly. I think it'll be the better bike for this route because it is that bit more technical. And I'm going to head up on the CRF afterwards, and then we're going to swap and do it again, see how it compares. Yeah, the hardest bit is always getting started on this. Right, here we go. I know Dave's done a bit of trials in the past, so let's see if he manages to do it. It's pretty tricky. Could do with maybe lowering the air pressures a bit. It's doing well. Right. How's that?
Slippy and bouldery. Not helped by the fact I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't see more than I can't look ahead, so it's quite good fun.
I think not being able to see where you're going might be helpful in this one.
I very rarely get the line I choose anyway, so yeah, probably right. That was kind of the way it looked, to be honest. It was very sticky in bits, very slippy in others, quite limited line choices, lots of big boulders and rocks bouncing you off, so definitely a good test for the two bikes.
I'm living up to my reputation. It's getting going again, it's going to be hard.
That looks challenging and slippy. What's your thoughts?
The H never fails to deliver. I'd say I have got it up here without dabbing before, but today, it is hard work.
It looks like it started off well.
Yeah, my thing is it's in my head because I know I've lowered this 450, but I'm still quite short, and once it gets into your head that, I can't put my foot down, then you've lost it, you know? I kind of just need to look up and focus on like the positive side and not like think about what's going to go wrong.
I could definitely see you're in a rut at the bottom. It was looking really good, and then you hit a front wheel, hit a stone and bounced you off your line, and then was all over.
I mean, having spent time at the Adventure Rider Centre and when Graham Jarvis has been there, the thing that I've always kind of taken away from that is just to try and get as much weight over the back wheel to basically force the grip, force the contact point, and like lower your air pressures as well. But on this, especially when you get going, from a standstill, it's a bit easy to kind of just stand up and lean forwards, but all you're really doing is spinning up the back wheel, and it's trying to just go slow, throttle control, and try and just put all that weight through the back wheel, but I don't always get it right. I'm in second gear on here, and I'm feathering, and I mean, it's a hydraulic clutch, it's not heavy, but you just start getting tired after quite a lot of it, so it'll be interesting to see how it compares on the CRF on that front.
Got to get to the top first.
We've been down, we've been up. Dave is now on the Honda CRF450L. I think it'll be interesting to see how he finds gear selection. I think he might have to be a bit more, well, it's a cable clutch, not hydraulic clutch, so Dave thinks that'll make it easier. I don't know. He's doing pretty well. Just catching your breath, Dave. How was that?
Kind of a little bit as I expected. The grip's a lot easier to find because when the going gets tricky and it turns into clutch work, you don't need as much clutch on this because there's not as much power, so it's easy to find grip. What surprised me was how well it held the line. The front end is nowhere near as twitchy, so it when you pick a line, it kind of seems to stick with it a bit better. But yeah, we'll keep going, see what happens. Not much further to go.
It's funny when it's your bike, you really want it to be like the one that wins. I was sitting there going, as Dave's kind of saying that he reckons that the CRF's a bit more suited to this than the EXC, which is like surprising because this is pretty technical stuff. Well, I'll ride it and I'll have a look.
Okay, Greg, you managed to get this far. Thoughts?
Yeah, you know, it's surprisingly easy to ride slow. I know you said you got to keep the revs up, so I did. But one finger clutch was fine, and yeah, I thought it would be harder than that. And I was much cleaner on this than on my EXC, which is my bike that I ride all the time as well. So it's interesting. Damn you!
Both Greg and I have arrived at the top. Let's find out what's happened this time. Greg, how are you?
Yeah, tired, you can tell. Like, I just didn't want to stand up for the rest of the night. I was really tired. I don't know if we made it more difficult than it is because we're testing the bikes or something, but like, I found that really challenging today. Sometimes you just get here and you whip straight up it, but yeah, a lot of stop starting. Definitely stalling a lot more on this. If it was your bike and you had it for like a long time, you'd get to understand where the biting point is and how many revs to put on. But it's definitely different to the EXC because, yeah, it kept cutting out. So I wasn't quite used to how much throttle I needed to give it. I don't know, yeah, like I said, I was getting tired. Fans on this, which it wasn't on mine. That might just be because mine's broken, but it's getting hot. But yeah, like, not a problem getting up here on this bike at all, you know. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
You need to keep the revs up, you need to keep the clutch feeding in all the time, and something like that where it gets out of hand, we get a bit out of shape. It's hard to be in the right body position, hard to keep clutch steady, hard to keep the throttle and everything feeding in. Because KTM was a lot more forgiving of me just putting it in a gear and, you know, lugging it up at dud 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 dud. Did a lot more thumping on the KTM really.
So I've brought people up here on CRF450Ls, which is obviously quite a different bike, even though it's kind of from the same family. And I always think that this is a bit of a clutch killer on those bikes. For that reason, why on off, on off, on off.
Yeah.
And especially if you're not that proficient and you're kind of just like power on, and that's the way to get up. So you've got a 250L.
Yeah.
How, obviously we haven't brought it up here, but obviously you know how it rides. Like, is this 450L of the same kind of on the same page as that 250?
No, it's not even similar. I mean, you can look at numbers like, oh, the horsepower similar, and you can look at, oh, it's one's heavier than the other. This is a totally different machine. This is based upon a real off-road machine, and the CRF450L engine even is really a road engine with a road clutch in, and they're very, clutches are known to be fragile, particularly on sand or technical ground like this. So I think if I brought a standard 250L up there, it's extra weight, less power at the lower revs, so you'd have to be on the revs even more, which means you'd be on the clutch even more, and that's probably why you get people burning out clutches up here on 250Ls. That makes a lot of sense.
Oh no, oh dear, there's no key. Oh no, I forgot to bring my chain as well.
But I'll just put my steering lock on too.
We've just done a bit of a road section, not very long, twisties, but oh my gosh, it's so much smoother. Like it's a totally, well, not a totally different bike, but it's a hell of a lot smoother on the roads. Like the less vibrations, it turns smoother.
Not true with the 450. Really twitchy steering. Yeah, it doesn't really like when you go into a bend. It's kind of shimmies and squirms itself. It doesn't really hold the line on a bend very well. You've got to be really kind of on it, and when you stand up on it as well, which you can do really easily with the CRF, it's quite relaxing. It automatically puts you in like a race position, puts you over the front of the bars, so your kind of elbows go out, and you need that weight on the front wheel to give it that kind of, like you were saying before, it's a real thoroughbred machine, isn't it, compared to the CRF in terms of like, it's a race machine almost. It wants to go all the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's how they're built and that's how they're sold.
Yeah.
And a lot of the trail riding aspect is actually about how you kind of tame it a bit and tone it down. But,
yeah.
So you're more mechanically minded than me. Do you think some of that twitchiness on the front end is the steering head bearings, or do you think that's just the way the bike is?
Greg, I think, I mean, you said that this is an old bike. It rides very nicely. I'm lucky enough to be able to ride a lot of new KTM and Huskies in particular at the Adventure Rider Centre, and so I know what a new bike feels like. And your bike is pretty tight. It's not, you know, there's nothing moving anywhere it shouldn't. Rear brake is adjusting, but apart from that, it's pretty tight. And I think it's all about the length of the swing arm at the back and the head angle geometry, the tight front wheel. It feels compact, it feels nimble, it feels like it wants to go. You know, it's like a thoroughbred racehorse, isn't it?
So this is my personal favourite lane. It's also on the Trans-Euro Trail. I don't want to get preachy. There's lots of people on the Trans-Euro Trail Facebook group and all the rest of it, and that have got big bikes, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. I guess the point is that in the UK, the trail riding, some of it is technical, and I guess it is more suited to bikes like we're riding today.
The tech was always designed with a smaller bike in mind, but it just so happens that large sections of it are perfectly rideable by average riders on larger bikes. But what you can't assume is that all of the sections are rideable by average riders on larger bikes. That's a very dangerous thing to do, as you can see today here.
And it kind of ties into that circular kind of conversation of road versus trail. because we've done quite a lot of road today.
Yep.
And that's the nature of trail riding in the UK. And a GS would have been far more comfortable, or even a 690 or a 1090, it would have been far more comfortable on those roads. But then you have the trails, and it's where do you make your compromise? And if you're going out into the unknown, what would you rather have, comfort on the road or a more manageable bike on the trickier trails? And there's no definitive answer to it, but where do you think the CRF450L fits into that?
It's a continuum. And if you imagine, you look at your KTM 450 at one end, it's a thoroughbred off-road race bike, and it's designed for terrain just like this. Difficult, nadgery, delicate, technical, tricky, wet, slimy, and that's what it does best. But we see that when you go on the road with it, it's pretty pig awful. A 1090, on the other hand, is designed to be an adventure bike and would be fantastic in Scandinavia on nice big open unsurfaced roads, big hard packed trails, and fantastic on the roads. But I'd be really wary about taking one down there. In answer to your question, where does the CRF450L sit? The answer is it sits in the middle. If you had those two bikes in your garage now, you could conceivably get rid of the KTM 450 and the 1090. You could probably put a seat concept seat on the 450L, and as you'll find out later, you can sit at 75 miles an hour on the motorway on it, reasonably comfortably and calmly. But then you can come here and do this. And so for me, it's where does it sit on that continuum? Somewhere in the middle. It's a really specific tool. And if you're interested in your multi-day, putting luggage on and doing roads and doing trails like this, more technical stuff, it's not unique, but it's one of not very many bikes that we've got.
So Dave, we're here in the Lake District in this fantastic rustic cabin, Noel's secret cabin, location not disclosed.
Deliberately.
From my point of view, the KTM 450 EXC, it's a 2013 model. It's my personal bike. It was my only bike for about 4 years until I recently got another road bike. And it was my first bike that I ever started doing any kind of trail riding on. So it's been well maintained. It's a little bit rough around the edges, but and it's also been adventurized by myself. So we can talk a bit about what I've done in a minute. So what's the spec of the 450? Is it yours? I know you went to Morocco on it. Like, how come you've got this bike?
Okay, so the bike isn't mine. It belongs to Honda UK. I was lucky enough to be invited along to the press launch back in, I think it might have been November last year. And subsequently, I asked them if I could borrow the bike for a limited amount of time to go and do a bit of testing on it, to go down to, well, I didn't actually ask them if I could borrow it to go to Morocco. I asked them if I could borrow the bike to do a bit of test riding on it. And then after that, they very kindly said it would be fine for me to take their brand new shiny CRF450L to Africa. And since then, obviously, we've been riding here, and we've got the Kielder 500 Rally coming up, which you're going to ride it. So it isn't mine. It's now done the best part of 6,000 kilometers, and it is not in standard trim in terms of the fact that there are some things bolted onto it, but there are no major modifications to the bike at all. It's in standard running trim, with the exception that it has rim locks, heavy-duty tubes, and different tyres than standard on. But we should say that both bikes do have the same tyres on for this test.
Okay, but there are some other differences on the bike. It's got a different tank, it's got handguards, it's got some adventure spec parts. So
yes. So in terms of when I said there's no differences to the actual running condition of the bike, the engine is clearly standard, the suspension is in standard trim, it's not been lowered, there have been no major modifications made in terms of mechanically. However, you are correct, it has a larger tank on than standard. It has some handguards on to protect the levers. It has some adventure spec parts that we've manufactured and bolted on to it, including a slightly higher screen, some electrical takeoffs from the battery, and some other parts, including bash plates and a side stand foot and a rear rack and some rack pannier mounts, and so they're things that have been bolted onto the bike in addition to its standard trim, but nothing has been fundamentally changed about the bike's mechanics.
So my 450 looks quite different to how I bought it in 2013. It's got, I guess the most noticeable ones, it's got a large tank on it. I think that's it's either an 11 or 13 litre tank. I should know that, I should check. So it's got a larger aftermarket tank. The suspension, it has been lowered. I'm quite short, I'm 5'7", so I've used a kit that I got from Australia that lowers the front and the rear the same. I think it's about maybe 22 mil lower. It's got a lower seat there as well. And I've got various things like auxiliary lights on the front. And the way that my luggage is set up, I've got the Krieger OS system on the back, and I also have an OS bag up front, in front of my headlight. It's got a Garmin Montana GPS mounted, but pretty much they're very, very similar bikes in terms of taking the stock bike and preparing it for multi-day.
Adventurizing it for those multi-day trails.
My engine is totally stock, the exhaust is stock.
What isn't stock on your bike that I noticed yesterday, because I do get to ride these bikes and new versions of these Huskies down at the Adventure Rider Centre, is the transmission of power on your bike to the back wheel is unbelievably smooth compared to a standard bike. And I questioned you about that, and there's a bit of a sneaky addition there.
I forgot that. So yeah, I have a set of I've got a Cush Drive rear wheel and a essentially they're Linden Poskett's old rally wheels that I bought off Linden. So it's I think Talon hubs with XL rims on the front and back, and they're actually quite big and quite heavy, and they've kind of got much chunkier spokes as well. But yeah, that's different, and the reason why I got that is for, as you say, just to try and smooth out that rear transmission a little bit and take some of the strain off the drive shaft.
Yeah, the gearbox outfoot shaft bearing, which tends to, they get a lot of drag and pull as a constant snatch. Okay.
So both bikes had the same tyres on. They were Motorz Extreme hybrids. Mine was pretty fresh. Yours was
5,000 kilometers old,
Which, I mean, considering the amount of mileage, and you look at them, like they're still got life in them.
Well, the thing about this great is the edges are still hard. They're worn, but the edges are still crisp. And although I couldn't be bothered deflating mine because I'm really lazy and I don't want to get punctures, so mine was probably well overinflated. We did well.
The last thing I want to say before we get into this is that so you put on your review of your CRF450L when you were down in Morocco, and it had a lot of comments, and I think people were really interested to get a proper long distance kind of review of that. Now, I think I just want to address kind of up front this idea of impartiality, because it came up in some of the comments on there, and it came up not necessarily to do with this bike, but just generally in conversations. I've seen people kind of saying, well, okay, if you're given a bike, you can't be impartial, and kind of questions around the whole kind of idea of journalism, really. And I think they're really relevant
they are.
Points. And you know, the thing is, so you haven't bought that bike, you've been loaned it, and essentially you're giving it back. Does that make you feel inclined to say nicer things? For me personally, I've gone out and spent, I think my bike was about $7,500 when I bought it new. You know, that was $7,500 of my money. Am I likely to kind of say it's
defend
your
position?
And I know, like, over the last 2 days as we've been riding and having conversations, I have been defensive of my bike because it is my bike and I love it and I've put a lot of time and effort into it. So it is hard for me to be kind of completely impartial. And yeah, I mean, so from your point of view, you know, it's no secret that you like the CRF.
I do.
You know, what would you say to people that are saying, well, you can't become completely impartial because you didn't buy it, it's not your money?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what impartial, if it's even possible to be impartial. I mean, how can you not have an opinion on something that you've spent 5,000 or 6,000 kilometers riding, you know, in some very remote places? I'm quite attached to the bike. I suppose one thing I would say in my defense is I am not, although I am following the trails of established journalists. I am not an established journalist. I do not make money by reviewing things, and I do not expect, after I hand this bike back, to be given another bike by Honda or by anyone else. I've never ever been given a bike on loan by a motorcycle company before. I don't make any money out of this. Traditional journalists, they need to be given motorcycles so that they can continue to write about these things, so that they can then produce media to put online or in written publications. That's their job. There has to be a relationship between manufacturers and media outlets, and they have to work together closely. And arguably, you could at that position say it's not in the interest of the journalists to say anything bad about a bike because they might not get another one. Whereas I'm in a really kind of privileged position that I'm not entirely sure why they gave the bike to me, but they did. I don't make any money from them selling or not selling. I'm not trying to sell. I think I'm reasonably impartial, because if I say something horrible about the Honda and they never give me another one, well, life won't be any different than it was before they gave me this one. My wage doesn't come from reviewing motorbikes. Yeah. So I'm attached to the bike, and I wear my heart on my sleeve and say I do really genuinely like the bike, but I don't feel as if I'm in any way obliged to say that for any reason.
Okay, that's probably as much as we're going to kind of need to say on that. Yeah. Like it's a conversation that everyone will have a slightly different point of view on.
Absolutely, that's fine. Yeah. I do understand impartiality is impossible. Yeah. You know, objectivity is very difficult.
Yeah. So like you, I am not a fully fledged motorcycle journalist. So, I don't necessarily have a set kind of scoring system of like 1 to 9 for each kind of thing that we can then pull out a figure at the end. Yeah. So a lot of this conversation is kind of down to gut and feeling as opposed to science. But I mean, you've already said your piece a little bit about the CRF. I was coming into this, I really didn't want to like it that much, because I'm like, is it really the perfect trail bike? Because I think I've got the perfect trail bike because I've done so much work to my KTM. I guess what I wanted to know on this test was, is this a more powerful CRF450L? Because I've taken many people out trail riding on their 250Ls. And the only time I ever get to ride it is when they get stuck on that kind of quite heavy, low-powered bike and they can't get it up the hill. And so I have to come back down the hill, get on their bike and ride it up. And I have burnt a few clutches out on some 250Ls doing that. So the first thing that I noticed getting on this bike is it's completely comparable to the EXC in terms of its height. As a short rider, it felt tall, it felt firm, and it really didn't feel like that kind of quite soft, wallowy 250L. It felt much more purposeful, much closer to my 450 than the 250L.
Yeah, agreed. So I own a 2013 250L, and the two bikes are chalk and cheese. For me, a lot of people disagree with this, but I think the 250L is a great road bike, dressed up to look like an off-road bike. I'm not saying it isn't capable of doing some quite impressive things, and that gives it some credibility as a trail bike. And in fact, for hard pack and non-surface roads, it's a joy. It's a lovely little thing. But when the going gets tough, really, it gets out of its depth quite quickly. The 450L is a totally different machine.
Yeah, and I guess that gives this a little bit of context in that the kind of riding that we did yesterday is the riding that I would choose to do on just a Saturday or out with my friends trail riding. And it is quite technical, and it's not necessarily the kind of riding that's like just sit back and look at the scenery. It's what can I get done in a day that feels adventurous, and purposefully choose some of the more difficult trails. And I think, like you say, the 250L, it's got a different approach, isn't it? It's not necessarily for that purpose.
No, I don't believe it is. It's not designed for hard trail riding. It's a great versatile bike that can ride trails, and I think it would have got down most of the trails we did yesterday, but I would question its ability to get up a lot of them. And also, it has a very soft. The suspension on the 250L is a relatively. I struggle to say cheap, but it certainly is nowhere near as capable as suspension on both these machines.
So I know that you've ridden quite a lot of EXCs in the past at the Adventure Rider Centre in Spain and stuff like that, but they've not necessarily been trimmed out for adventure riding.
No.
You know, what were your impressions getting on my bike?
Yeah, Huskies down at the Adventure Rider Centre. I was really pleasantly surprised, because one of the things that I feel quite threatened, I think is probably the word, when it comes to riding the stock 450 Huskies and KTMs, is that I find them very tall. So straight away, your bike felt immediately to me more like the kind of adventure bike and the trail riding bike that I'm more comfortable with. It was very low for me, so I can flat foot it very, very easily, which was a pleasure, which is really, really nice. And it also had that slightly uncomfortable top heavy feeling that you get when you take a dirt bike essentially and you make it into an adventure bike, and that comes from the fact it's got luggage bolted onto the back, and it's got the larger tank on the front, and you've kind of screwed lots of bits to it, and it gives it particularly on the shorter wheelbase bikes, as I now think of them. Maybe we'll talk about that in a bit, like the Huskies and the KTMs. It also gives it a quite unstable feeling when you're on tarmac at any kind of speed, because there's a lot of weight on the back, and it gives it a slightly twitchy sensation. But yours is lowered, which is nice. And also straight away, we discussed briefly earlier, the power delivery on it. I couldn't place why it didn't feel snatchy. Why I could tell the difference. It felt a lot more smooth than the traditional delivery, and of course that's because of your cush drive. So how did I feel? I was pleasantly surprised by it. It felt a lot more. It felt a lot more like a bike I would be immediately comfortable with, like an adventure bike, adventure trail bike, rather than a dirt bike, and it felt a lot smoother than I thought it would.
Yeah, so I have spent quite a bit of time adventurizing it, and that's just through spending hours. I mean, it's done about 460 hours.
That's amazing. Amazing.
20,000 kilometers on that.
Super sweet.
And you know, I've looked after the engine and done the oil changes and all the rest of it, but it's just been done through kind of learning what works and what doesn't, and how to change it to make it suit me. So I guess the point there is that whatever I've bought that bike for, over time I've spent quite a lot of money on top of that purchase price to turn it into something else.
Okay,
so it wasn't like that from the showroom.
So here's a question for you. If we ignore the tank situation and we just assume that as default at this point in time, for almost every bike that we might choose to buy to go and do anything adventurous, we're probably going to have to put a new tank on it. Nothing whatsoever has been done to the CRF in terms of there haven't been any wheel changes, hasn't been lowered, hasn't been. How did you feel getting on what is essentially a stock CRF compared to your modified KTM?
So going the other way, it felt tall.
Yeah, of course.
But of course, my bike would be tall if I hadn't lowered it.
It would be taller, yeah.
Yeah. But it felt tall. I was expecting, from your comments the other day, I was expecting the seat to be softer. It's still quite a firm seat. You're definitely not riding on a cushion. But other than that, they felt quite similar. Once I got riding, it made me realize how much time on my bike I've got elbows up and I'm kind of crotch like right up over the tank, and it wants me to ride aggressively. The KTM wants me to ride aggressively.
It puts your body into that position naturally. So all you really have to do is go like that, and you're in a race position.
And that is where you need to be to get the most out of the steering, which is twitchy on the roads on my bike. Whereas on the 450L, it felt more comfortable and it felt more planted while we were riding. Especially, I think on the trail sections, it's harder to notice that, but on the road sections, you definitely felt that you weren't having to be up over the front. You could be a bit more relaxed, and it felt more planted. And considering they got the same tires and everything, it definitely wasn't as twitchy. And you've got an engineering background. I mean, you'll know more why that is than I will. Like,
yeah, I mean, so that when I got the bike, I keep saying we. I think of it, when you go traveling by yourself, you become a bit demented after a while. So you become a team. So me and the bike, when we got down to the Adventure Rider Centre, we luckily had a complete range of all of the Husky bikes that have ever been made in the last 2 years. I sort of sat there, and so we measured. We actually physically got a tape measure out and measured the wheelbases and to see what the difference is. So Honda tell us they've lengthened the swing arm by 1 inch. which in theory should give a lot more straight line stability. But they also tell us that they slacken the head angle slightly, which should make it track a lot more in a lot more planted fashion, and should stop the problem with an adventure bike, particularly when you start with a bike as twitchy as an EXC450. Is that essentially it is, I'm using the word twitchy. What that means is the bike is designed to want to change direction quickly. And of course it's designed to do that. It's a race bike. That's what racers want to do. They want to change direction quickly without losing momentum. Whereas trail riding, that's not really something that's a huge concern for us. So the Honda guys, I guess, have said, well, trail riding, it's not really a huge consideration wanting to change direction quickly. But what is a nice consideration is to have a nice relaxed riding position and to not have the steering sort of constantly twitching and feel when you put weight on the back of the bike that the front wheel goes light at speeds on the motorway. And so they've made these head angle changes and they've extended the swing arm, and there is a overall difference between the axles on the bikes. And that's why you get a different sensation between the two bikes. One is a lot more relaxing to ride, in my opinion, than the other. And I think that's what you see that as.
Yeah. And I guess it comes into the conversation that we'll probably have throughout this, is that, what kind of riding do you want to do? Are you looking to have as much fun in 8 hours as you possibly can, doing the most difficult kind of riding as you can find, or are you looking to get on something that you can have multi-day journeys on and actually ride with a bit more comfort over distance? So with that in mind, every time I pulled up next to you on the road, you were looking over at me going, "It's so noisy." And it's not something I've ever thought of before, because it's my bike and I'm used to it, Yeah. But then, you saying that has got me thinking, while I'm on the CRF, like, actually on the road sections where you're going 56 miles an hour, all I can actually hear is wind noise. And it just got me thinking about how effective or ineffective my helmet was, because actually I couldn't hear the engine. I could hear the wind noise was louder than the engine noise on those road sections.
Which is almost unheard of, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so there's definitely a noise element here. I mean, on the side, on the stickers, so again, when we're down at the Adventure Rider Centre, I just got on this bike and I rode from the middle of the UK down to southern Spain. And when I got there, I was just astonished. Normally when I get off a bike after doing 800k on a dirt bike, I'm going to have ringing in my ears unless I'm ear plugged up, or I'm certainly going to be feeling a little bit of tingling or numbness in my fingers because I'm sat in this position. And I could get off the Honda after extended miles like that, and I wouldn't say I felt particularly fresh, but I certainly didn't feel as battered as I would normally feel. So on the actual down tube, on the head steerer tube, there's a little sticker and it gives noise levels, and the noise level output for the Honda is something like 70. I can't remember what it says, 75 decibels or something, and on the KTM it's 94. And decibels are a logarithmic scale, which means it gets bigger as you go up. It's not linear. I mean, there's no question that the KTM is noticeably louder than the Honda, and fairly unsurprisingly, the faster you go, the bigger the difference in noise gets. We didn't do any motorway miles yesterday, but I can tell you that at 80 miles an hour, the CRF makes, well, you can't hear it.
Yeah.
Whereas every time I open the throttle on your EXC, you get this which to start with is kind of from a hooligan aspect, that, and we'll talk about engine in a bit. The bottom end grunt and that, it's great fun. But 50 miles on the road later, by the time we arrived here, I was not interested in hearing any more of that. You know what I mean? I no thanks.
Well, and again, it's that kind of, what kind of ride are you, what kind of journey are you doing? I have my KTM has got a stock exhaust, and I'll repack that. Some people will go out and get a loud pipe because that's what they want, Yeah. Personally, I don't believe that's the best approach to trail riding. It's trying to be as quiet as you can and being unobtrusive, but that's for me. And on that respect, I think the Honda does really well.
It's astonishing that they've made a big effort, I'm told, to make it quiet. They've filled the swing arm with foam. They've put engine covers on the sides of the engine. They've modified the air inlet. They've made quite a significant number of changes to it to make sure that it is this unbelievably quiet bike. And not only that, but they've removed vibrations by changing the crank. So it's also, I find, very smooth. If we put noise along with vibrations, again, by the time I got here last night after 50 miles, you could definitely tell I'd been things rattling and shaking. And whereas the CRF is comparatively, and you keep saying this to me and it's true, for a trail riding bike, it is silky smooth.
Okay, yeah. So, and this is the point that we were talking about last night, is that I think it would be dodgy
You use the
ground.
word misleading.
Well, yeah, I think it would be misleading to say to people that the difference between the EXE and the CRF is that the CRF is completely silky smooth, because it is within the context of small, lightweight, single cylinder trail bike. It is smoother.
It is the smoothest of those designations at this point that I've ever ridden. However,
you get off that and you get onto my Honda CB500X, and that is smooth, and you could go even smoother on different bikes. So the difference between a twin and a single, I wouldn't want anyone that has been used to riding kind of quite big twin adventure bikes to get on this and think they're going to have a completely smooth ride.
Absolutely.
If you've never ridden a dirt bike before, you're still going to get on that Honda and be like, whoa, it's a little bit kind of, but that's just the nature of those bikes, isn't it? Something that I noticed while I was following you, so when you were on my EXC, and when I ride my EXC, you've got power on tap, so you can kind of pretty much any gear you're in, you can, even in top gear on the road, you can always just and it'll get you there. And the thing that has always kind of got me to roll off the throttle more than anything is just the wind and the front end starting to wobble. But I know that if I had some bigger balls, I could probably get it up to 110 miles an hour if I really wanted to. But I struggled on the CRF to keep up with you a little bit on those bits. And I think, you had the power on tap. I was looking for another gear. Is there a seventh gear here?
Yeah.
And you definitely felt like you were wide open and there was nothing left. That was as much as you were going to get.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So talking about engines, I mean, there's a definite, there are similarities of both 450s. And to be honest, that's kind of where the similarities end. I understand why. So let's put this myth to rest. There are two versions of the CRF450L. There's the European version, which is sold in Europe fairly clearly. It is also sold in Australia, Australian markets too. And then there's the American and North American version. And the two engine specs are very different. I have actually seen a power curve for both those bikes at the press release, but I wasn't allowed to reproduce them or photograph them in any way. And I can tell you that the stories are completely true, that if that curve is to be believed, and I've no reason to believe that they wouldn't be correct, the EU bike produces 25 horsepower and the American bike produces close to 45 horsepower. So,
and the EXE is about 50.
I think it's more than twice. It is more than twice the power of the CRF. Then the discussion begins. I've never ridden the uncorked version of the CRF450L, and it remains a great regret of mine, because I think the two bikes are utterly identical. It's merely a case of swapping the throttle tube and the ECU. In Australia already, they're selling these kits for 250 Australian dollars, about 150 pounds, UK pounds, and you can have a full power CRF. And I've never experienced that, and I'm really gutted to say that, because there is no doubt at all that what appears to be true on paper, which is that the bike, that 450 engine, is electronically strangled essentially, and that is the case because of European regulations relating to road bikes and emissions and noises and all kinds of things. And so, unsurprisingly, the ride between the two bikes is very, very different. One of the things I loved about getting on the EXC was just that pure, unbridled and slightly childish joy of just snapping the throttle open and you get that lovely kick and off you go. And that was lovely, really, because I hadn't felt that for a long time. Having ridden the last 5,000 or 6,000 k I've done have all been on the CRF, so that was kind of a bit of a smile inside my helmet, I said before on my review of the CRF, you don't need extra power, and truthfully, I don't believe that you do, but it's quite good fun. However, in reality, I would ask you this question: did you feel at any point when we rode at the H yesterday that you needed any more power than either of those bikes gave you on that terrain?
On the H, which is the technical bit, low end, no, absolutely not. Okay, so the lack of power was all about at the 70 miles an hour on the A roads, you know, kind of running out. On the bits where it was actual trail riding, there was not a single moment that I felt like that bike was lacking. So I would kind of definitely put it in the same category as the EXC in that respect. Anything from the technical bits going up the H through to going through Slaley, where you've got big puddles, exactly the same as the EXC, lean back, little bit of a blip, front end goes light and you can go over. So all of that low end power was totally fine. I was surprised, having ridden CRF450Ls up the H, which has got a heavy kind of road clutch. I was expecting more of that of the 450L. I kind of, because it's got a cable clutch and not a hydraulic clutch, I was expecting it to be much heavier, full hand or at least 2 fingers, but it was totally fine with 1 finger clutch up there. All I would say is that I stalled it a lot, and I think that's partly down to the more time you spend with the bike, the more time you could get to understand, and you know intuitively how much of this to give with how much of that.
It definitely needs more revs at the bottom, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That you know, when you're riding it, you can bop 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 on the EXC. You just need a few more revs and a little bit on the clutch on that Honda.
Yeah, but the point you made was quite interesting, that actually on the EXC, because you have got that bit more power, you need to control it a bit more, and it's because it's quite easy to spin up.
Well, then you still need to use the clutch, yeah, because on that stuff it's so sticky and slippy. It seems to alternate between the two. You can feel the back end go, and then you've got to get on that clutch really quickly, because because there is so much grunt on it. Yeah, that makes it difficult in a different way. Okay, so my next question then, Greg, is one of the things I hear lots about on the various sort of social media channels where we discuss this bike is this idea about the fact that the Honda is 10 kilos heavier. So, you know, the half the power thing, we've discussed that, but it's 10 kilos heavier than the XC450. At any point yesterday, did you feel that the bike was, did you feel the bike was heavier at all? Could you tell about that weight?
So I dropped both bikes. I've dropped my EXC a lot, so I know how heavy that is. Yeah. And I dropped both bikes. And I guess the first thing to say is my EXC is a lot heavier than a showroom EXC.
Of course.
Because of the stuff that I've done to it.
Of course.
And I guess, well, that is the point, isn't it? That once you take a trail bike and you adventurize it, that the slight discrepancies in weight become moot points. You know, are you carrying more luggage than me? Have you got more water on the bike? I've got cameras on my bike. Have you got a full tank? How big is your tank? All those kinds of things kind of make that black and white, your bike is heavier than my bike, on the list.
Even down to the fact that your bike has been lowered. So what that means is it's easier to lever up.
Yeah.
Whereas on the standard EXC450, it's taller than the CRF. So even if the weights are identical, you know, in terms of you put the same weight on both those bikes and tried to lift it in the same place, the EXC would feel heavier. So, I mean, for me, tens of kilograms, once you get into sort of 20 kilograms plus, I can kind of tell the difference. But what you're saying is by the time you've adventurized your bike.
I think weight is far more important if you're racing it. Once you're adventurizing it, and the fact that people have got different things on different bikes, it's just not... So essentially, those two bikes in the current setup that we rode into yesterday, I think are in the same category weight.
I couldn't tell any difference.
Yeah. So the issue that everyone talks about is servicing and money. So the money side of it. So I think my bike, if you were to buy it new, is about eight and a half. I mean, and the prices of the CRF 450L are 9.5.
Yeah.
So they're kind of, there's £1,000 there, which to a certain extent is a bit of wiggle room for negotiation. But then you've also got my bike has had quite a lot of money spent on it.
Yeah, so you've got a situation there, haven't you, where if you're in the market for a new EXC450, you're going to spend 8.3, something like that. Assuming you don't get a deal from a dealer, but you could argue you could get a deal on either of those bikes. So let's just go with recommended retail price. So 8.3 for the KTM. If you were to buy that and you were to leave it in its stock trim and ride it out of your garage or wherever you keep your bike and go blasting around on every weekend for a day and bring it home, there would be a £1,200 difference if you did the same thing for both those bikes. And in that situation, if that's all you were going to do with it, then you'd clearly be £1,200 better off buying a KTM. But if you're going to buy that EXE450 and you're going to start modifying it in a bid to make it more capable for doing long distance road work, or trying to make it quieter, or trying to reduce the snatch on the drivetrain, or trying to make sure you can ride it at night with the lights that work, that kind of stuff. I mean, your wheels and your lights probably come to not much off £1,000, which straight away the difference between the two bikes, you know, becomes almost negligible.
Yeah.
Whereas they're two things that the CRF doesn't need anything doing to. So my gut feeling is, by the time you would adventurize those bikes in inverted commas to kind of where they are today, which is probably as close as they're ever going to get to being the same spec of bike, the price is not going to be that different. However, the CRF is always going to be that little bit more refined. It's always going to be better at speed on roads, because essentially the chassis and the headstock is different. In my opinion, comparing the EXE450 with the CRF450L is kind of a strange thing to do, because essentially they are a different motorcycle for a different customer. Neither one is better nor worse per se, but each one of them is better or worse at doing a specific job. It depends what job you want the bike to do.
So the issue, just to round up that money side, the challenge is for Honda is that you've got over here the Honda CRF450L, which is kind of one bike in its own little category, and then over here, well, because it's brand new, and then over here you've got, if you want to say, an EXE450, but you've got, from new, you can spend anything from £8,500 down to £2,500.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you've got the choice of all of that.
Yeah.
And so I think people are getting quite fixated about this idea of like £9,000 for this CRF450L.
When I can get an EXE for £3,000.
Yeah, exactly. You can, yeah, that's the thing. You could get an EXE for £3,000 and then spend £2,000 to adventurize it, and then end up with the bike that I've got now.
Yep.
But it's not like for like, because then you're going like new bike for second-hand bike. And you know, if we fast forwarded 6 years and we had a 6-year-old CRF450L, then, you know, maybe that's what people are waiting for. Maybe people just have to sit it out and wait, and then that bike becomes more affordable, just like all the other EXCs that you can get in Adventurize.
I mean, we know that people are going to spend £8,000 plus on new motorcycles. They do. You know, some people do, some people don't. And that's the bit when I said in my previous reviews, I don't feel it's my job to tell people what they should or shouldn't spend on a motorcycle. You know, I have never spent £10,000 on a motorcycle in my life. I would consider spending it on that CRF450L. If I was to buy a bike, I might well consider buying one. I'm surprising myself by saying that, but I probably will consider that. But yeah, I mean, the truth is, some people choose to spend that money, some people don't. If you're not in the market for a new motorcycle, you're not in the market for a CRF450L yet.
Yeah. So everyone knows with KTM EXCs, the servicing is kind of a big part of ownership of those bikes. I'd never serviced one before I bought this, and it's kind of turned me into a mechanic over the last 6 years. So by the book, I should be servicing mine every 15 hours. That's kind of the whole like ready to race service intervals. Well, in 15 hours...
You're not racing your bike,
No, no. And 15 hours in trail riding terms is, on average, if you're out for a day trail riding, that's about 5 hours, the engine hours that it'll clock.
Yeah.
And let's say you did, let's just keep a round figure of 100 miles. So that's essentially, by the book, a service every 300 miles.
500k.
Yeah, okay. Now, generally speaking, I double that. So I'll service it every 30 hours. So you're talking a service, I'll service my bike. And when I say service, that's an oil and filter change, really. Everything else, well, an oil and filter change. So I'm servicing mine every 600 miles, which is 1,000 kilometers. Now, I just did the Trans-Euro Trail through Netherlands, Belgium, and the UK. That was a 1,200 mile trip, 45 engine hours, and I didn't service it at all.
That's
on
2,000 kilometers.
Yeah, so I serviced it before I left, and I serviced it when I came back. And touch wood, I think that bike engine-wise is performing perfectly fine. I've not had any major mechanicals in that at all. So you can kind of say that bike on my service intervals will get me through a 2,000 kilometer trip without an oil change.
And that's not something you did with the bike from new. So it's not as if you can't say, well, that's new, you don't know what effect that's going to have. It's almost got 500 hours on it.
Yeah.
So we're saying that and yesterday it pulled and ran absolutely beautifully. There's no smoke, there's no signs of any, I mean, obviously there is some degenerative engine wear taking place, but it doesn't appear to have affected it adversely at this point in its life.
And so the issue is, and this is for Honda to address, is
it absolutely is.
You've got that CRF450L that they're saying that you need to service every 600 miles.
Every 1,000 k.
Yeah, every 1,000 kilometers. If you took my principle and applied it to that, then you're extending that 1,000 kilometers to 3,000 kilometers. But I'm not an engineer. I'm just doing it from guesswork and kind of gut.
It is slightly different with the 450L though, because what we have to bear in mind is that 1,000 kilometer service interval is given to both the 45 horsepower variant of the bike and the 25 horsepower variant. Honda make no allowance whatsoever for the fact that CRF as it sits down there cannot really rev over 6,000 revs. Whereas it's not even breaking a sweat at 6,000 revs. Whereas the 45 horsepower version, if they're saying that's a 1,000 kilometer service interval for 45 horsepower, then how can that at 25 horsepower with a rev limiter on it possibly have a service interval of 1,000 kilometers? That what they haven't done is they haven't differentiated between those two positions, and that is the point that you're making, really.
Yeah, and that's the thing that they've really, I don't know if they haven't thought it through, but that's the opportunity for them, is to basically say that this bike, it's not EXE servicing. It doesn't have to be. But they've not officially said that. They've not put their stamp of approval on that. Nope. It's up to the owner to figure out how comfortable they are extending that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But if you were extending it, the interesting thing is then it take the price and the service intervals, and although the bike looks like an EXE, it's actually sitting closer to something like a 690 then.
Certainly.
And if it's in the same category as a 690, albeit with less power, it's also a lot lighter.
Yeah, so what you end up with is we're back on that line again, that continuum. And I do believe that if you look at the engine size, if the 450 EXE is the hybrid, is the super high spec race bike at one end, and the 690 kind of sits further along that line toward a 1090 KTM, so let's keep with the KTM analogy, you're more of a road bike, then the CRF450L is closer to the 690 than it is certainly to the 450, although it has a 450 engine and it looks like an EXE 450, which I think is what causes everyone to say, whoa, you make a judgment about it. It actually is closer to the KTM and 690, albeit it benefits from being 20 kilos lighter, which is massive thumbs up. However, its service intervals are probably less than the KTM 690. So the question then is, although it does everything as admirably and as well, is that 20 kilograms of weight saving and the taller seat height and the quieter, the quieter demeanor of the bike and the taller sixth gear, and or all those things, do they equate to being worthwhile for you for that reduced service interval?
I think, to try and conclude what is potentially a very long conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We could go on forever, couldn't we? Yeah.
Is that the thing that I've taken away from this weekend is it's about asking yourself. It's not about kind of trying to listen to what manufacturers and marketing people are telling you what you need. It's about asking yourself, really, really, what do you need out of a bike? What kind of
what are the criteria that would suit you best?
Yeah, are you like me? So right now I have a young family. I very rarely get out on my bike. When I do, I want to be able to go out for 8 hours from my front door, come back, have some fun. To do that, I still think that the EXE is a good bike for me because it allows me to take on more challenging terrain. And I don't really mind that it's a little bit vibey and all the rest of it. I quite like the aggressiveness. It makes me feel happy in those 8 hours. And also from the servicing point of view, if I'm only riding it once a month, that only equates to
We'll change every couple of months or 3 months or whatever.
Yeah, and over the year, that's maybe 10 litres of oil over a whole year. So I can live with that. Under that criteria, I quite like my bike, and it is my bike, and I am not impartial, but I don't know that I would swap my bike for the CRF tomorrow. However, if you are wanting to do the Trans-Euro Trail and take a week to 2 weeks off and do some extended stuff and go away, if your life allows you to take a weekend off every month to go to another part of the country and do some trail riding around there, then I think the CRF450L is a fantastic kind of, or you should definitely be considering it. Yeah. You can ride it out of the showroom and go away and do that without having to do much more to it.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say both bikes can do the same as each other. But I would, if I could make a new category in the motorcycle sort of genre of what we do, which is trail riding or adventure, I would say that the KTM 450 EXE is a great short distance trail bike, and the CRF 450L is an awesome long distance trail bike.
But is it around the world trail bike?
Again, yes, you could set out around the world on a CRF 450L. Would I set out around the world on a CRF 450L? That would depend on the trails I was using. If I was doing, if I was following, say, Walter Kolbach's Sibirsky Extreme Trail over to Magadan, yes, I probably would, because I know there's some very technical riding in that. I'm not a great rider, and that lack of weight in my light packing would be really great. If I was going to do less aggressive stuff, the answer is no. I wouldn't. I'd take something a little bit more comfortable, a little bit with a little bit longer service interval. So again, it's what you're going to use it for.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to have more choice.
Yeah, choice is a good thing.
Choice is always a good thing.
Okay. Well, I'm sure a lot of people will have thoughts and comments on this.
Oh, I'm sure they will.
And we've got the CRF 450L for a little bit longer.
Yep.
The plan is to do the Kielder 500 on that, which is part of the Adventure Spec Challenge.
So we'll soon see how comfortable the seat is over 2 days on that job.
Yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing is that we might end up doing that alongside the CB500X, which is obviously much more comfortable, but much heavier and all the rest of it.
Maybe. I'm not too keen, but we'll see.
So keep firing your comments in. We'll do our best to answer them, and if we don't, I'm sure someone else will.
Absolutely, yeah, one way or the other, yeah. So thanks very much for sticking with us this long, if you have.
It has been quite long, and we've got to ride home now.
Absolutely, yeah. At least it's not raining.